In today's episode, we got our hands on the all-new 2017 GMC Acadia. Now, you may notice that there are two 2017 GMC Acadias. We have the one we're taking a look at right here, and then we have the Acadia Limited. The Acadia Limited is what GMC is calling the previous generation GMC Acadia. So the 2017 Acadia Limited and the 2017 Acadia are the same vehicle, but the all-new 2017 Acadia without the Limited is an entirely different animal. The all-new 2017 Acadia bucks the trend in the industry and actually becomes considerably smaller for this generation. That may sound unusual, but if you dig a little deeper, it makes more sense. The previous generation Enclave, Acadia, and Traverse were all just about the same size, and it didn't make too much sense for the Traverse and the Acadia to be exactly the same size, competing against exactly the same vehicles. So what they've done is they've made this smaller to compete more directly with the Toyota Highlander and the Honda Pilot, and they've made the Traverse larger to compete with those larger three-row crossovers. As a result, this Acadia is not only smaller and lighter than previous generations of the Acadia, but we also find a four-cylinder engine under the hood, and the price tag is very competitive with the Highlander. This actually starts about $600 less. Of course, as we've come to expect from GMC, there is also a Denali model of the Acadia, and that will top out at around $57,000, and this is a competitor to the Acura MDX. This is just about the same size, and we actually have a little bit more power under the hood. The front end styling is definitely GMC. We have this large GMC logo. Our model has, of course, the Denali grille, which is a little different than the base grille. There's an awful lot of chrome going on. It's also quite bold, very much like the GMC truck line. We also have HID headlamps in the top end trim, and even lower end trims get projector beams. We have an LED daytime running lamp strip right up top and fog lamps right down below. The new Acadia also keeps up with the latest technology from the competition. We have radar adaptive cruise control well hidden in the bumper, and a camera right here below the grille because we do have a 360-degree camera system. The size difference between this and the previous generation Acadia is very easy to see if you park them next to each other, because this is a full 7 inches shorter than the previous generation model at 193.6 inches long. As far as three-row crossovers go, that means this is now in very direct competition with the Toyota Highlander and the Honda Pilot. This is 11 inches shorter than the brand new 2018 Chevy Traverse. The new Chevy Traverse is taking the large end of the segment, giving us more cargo space in the back and more third-row passenger room. Because the Acadia has shrunk overall, we find a notable reduction in cargo room. It's about half the space that we found in the 2016 model year. We also find a little bit less third-row passenger room, and we no longer have an 8-seat option. You can get your Traverse with either 7 or 6 seats depending on the trim. Perhaps more important than everything, however, is that the Acadia has lost an incredible amount of weight. The Acadia, the Traverse, and the Enclave were some of the heaviest three-row crossovers sold in America, and that's no longer the case. This actually ends up lighter than a Toyota Highlander, meaning we have better acceleration and better fuel economy than the previous generation. For 2017, GMC has cut nearly 800 pounds out of this vehicle in terms of overall weight. That's an incredible crash diet. Out back, we find a very vertical hatch that helps maximize the cargo space. We also find a fairly short bumper. This doesn't stick out very far from the body. Twin exhaust tips well integrated into that large chrome section down there, another large chrome section right up here, and these tail lamps with light pipes that have sort of a C-shaped theme. General Motors puts the backup camera right here below the GMC logo, and they put the release for the hatch right down here just above the bumper. Because General Motors was able to remove so much weight from this vehicle, they were able to put a 4-cylinder engine in the base model instead of a 6-cylinder engine. But this is not a turbocharged 4-cylinder like we find in some of the competition. Like the Toyota Highlander, this uses a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine in the base model, and we get 193 horsepower and 188 pound-feet of torque from that engine. That's a little bit more power and a little bit less weight overall than the Toyota Highlander. Of course, most models will have the same 3.6-liter V6 engine that we're driving this week. It produces 310 horsepower and 271 pound-feet of torque. Both engines are mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission by default, and all-wheel drive is available with either engine. Fuel economy ranges from 23 miles per gallon to 20 miles per gallon depending on which engine you get and whether or not you get all-wheel drive. Now that doesn't put this model at the top of the pack when it comes to overall fuel economy. Thanks to the 8-speed automatic that we find in the Highlander, you will still get better fuel economy in that particular model. We may see a 9-speed automatic transmission under this hood at some point, but we don't know when that will be. When you compare base trims to the Pilot or the Highlander, the seats are very comfortable up front. However, we are in the top-end Denali trim, and the lack of a 4-way adjustable lumbar support in a vehicle that costs this much does seem a little bit unusual. Although we do have a 4-way tilt telescopic steering column, and the passenger seat has exactly the same range of motion as the driver's seat. Therefore, my overall score up front is going to be 8 out of 10 points, because top-end versions of the Ford Explorer that will cost about this much will have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and seat massage capability. The model that we're taking a look at this week is the 6-passenger version. So we do have these captain's chairs in the second row. They are quite comfortable and they slide forward and backward, and they have a decent amount of recline to them. The 6 and 7-passenger seating capability of the Acadia is one of the major changes for this generation, because the previous generation was available in an 8-passenger model, but this is overall shorter than that. That's not to say that overall legroom is limited, however, because with this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I still have about 6 inches of legroom left. If I scoot over to the right side of the vehicle, where this front seat was all the way back in its tracks, I still have about an inch left. That's because we have 111.8 inches of total legroom. That's front row, plus second row, plus third row. That's about 1.5 inches more overall legroom than you'll find in a Toyota Highlander, a little bit more than you'll find in the Honda Pilot, but notably less than you'll find in the larger Chevy Traverse. To get into the third row, the second row seats flip and fold, but they don't fold in the same manner. You'll notice this seat right here actually folds a little further forward than this passenger side seat. The reason for that is this second row seat can actually have a child seat latched into place while you slide it forward like that to get into the third row. That child-friendly feature is something that we find in some of the larger crossovers out there, but not generally in the size category of the Highlander and the Pilot. As I said before, the third row really is one of the areas where we see the most reduction in room versus the outgoing Acadia. If I sit upright, my head does touch the ceiling, and my knees are definitely touching the seat back right here of the second row. However, if I move the second row seat just a few inches further forward, I can comfortably sit up front in the second row, and I could passably sit back here in the third row. Like the second row seats, the third row seats also recline. The seat I'm sitting in is actually in its most reclined position, and the one over here on the driver's seat is in a very, very upright position to help you square off the cargo area, but you can't really sit back here with the seat in that position for very long. The other prime area where the Acadia shrinks versus the 2016 model year is the cargo area, because we now find 12.8 cubic feet of storage space behind the third row. That's about half of what we found in the 2016 model year. It's also about half of what we find in the new Chevy Traverse, but it is almost exactly the same as the Kia Sorento or the Toyota Highlander. That means that in our roller bag test, I was only able to fit 2 of these 24-inch roller bags right back here, and the third row seats had to be in one of their upright positions. It doesn't have to be the most upright, but it does have to be one notch away from comfortable. That's not too unusual, of course, because most 3-row crossovers have fairly limited cargo capacity in the back because of their overall design. If you really want to carry 7 people and a decent amount of cargo, you're going to have to buy a minivan. Under the cargo area load floor, we do find a little bit of available storage space, but not enough to really seat these 24-inch roller bags down in there to improve the cargo capacity much beyond these 2 bags. When it comes to our exclusive trunk comfort index, I'm going to give this 7 out of 10 points. I do like the fact that you are able to put 2 of those 24-inch roller bags back here and put 2 people in the third row bench, but I would like just a little bit more room. You'll definitely notice more room in something like a Ford Explorer, but in many ways this is no longer the direct competitor to the Explorer. That would actually be the Traverse. I know I keep saying this, but it is important to remember that the Traverse and the Acadia have been split apart to sort of attack both ends of this 3-row crossover segment. This is going after the smaller entries like the Highlander and the Sorento, whereas the Traverse is now going to go after the larger entries like the Pathfinder and the Explorer. This gives you a little bit more room than we find in the Highlander or the Sorento, and the Traverse gives you more room than you find in those larger 3-row crossovers. As we take a spin around the interior, keep in mind we are in the top-end Denali trim. However, this does not have all the options, so we don't have a moonroof in this particular model. We do have Denali embroidered right there on the front seat headrests, and you won't find height-adjustable seat belts up front. They are fixed into place. The model we're driving has contrasting piping on the leather upholstery, and these seats are both heated and ventilated. The front doors are made from a combination of hard and soft touch plastics. You'll find soft touch plastics in the upper portion of the doors and around the armrest, and hard plastics right down here around the bottle holder and the storage cubby in the door. Since we're in the Denali model, we have this faux wood trim running across the doors and the dashboard. Over on the dashboard, we find some contrasting stitching, more of that same faux wood trim, and some metallic trim right around the air vents. The upper portion of the dashboard is all made from a soft touch plastic. And moving over to the dashboard, we have 2 large air vents. You can see that we do have the 360-degree camera system in this particular model. The glove compartment is a large bin style, and we do have enough room in here to store a large tablet computer. The Acadia gets General Motors' latest infotainment and navigation system. It is a touchscreen and it supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. We have a few direct access buttons right there below the screen, power volume knob, a menu tune knob right over there. We also have direct access to the tone settings, which is kind of a handy feature. Around the radio, we have a band of aluminum trim, and then below that we find the controls for the front two climate control zones. The third zone is actually right up here in the touchscreen infotainment system. Below the climate controls, we have a storage cubby where you can very easily put smartphones. We have two USB inputs, a power outlet, and an auxiliary input for the radio. You'll also find the heated and ventilated seat controls on either side of that cubby. Between the front seats, we find more of that faux wood trim in this large center console, two large cup holders, the hazard light button, and the traction control enable disable button. The gear shift is a fairly traditional console shifter. Low is all the way to the back, and then we have a plus minus button right on top for manual gear changes. Behind the shifter, we have an unusual knob in a three-row crossover. This is an all-wheel drive control knob because we can force the Acadia into two-wheel drive mode for improved fuel economy. We also have an automatic four-wheel drive mode that you can use on-road, a sport mode, an all-terrain mode, and then a dedicated towing mode. These all use the all-wheel drive system to help improve traction. The mode that you're in dictates how the two clutch packs in the all-wheel drive system behave. If we're in the two-wheel drive mode, they're both open, so no power goes to any rear wheel. When we enter any of the all-wheel drive modes, the center clutch pack closes to allow power to be sent to the rear. And then the rear clutch pack will allow the vehicle to direct power across the rear axle, very much like Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. To the right of that, we have our parking sense enable and disable button, and we also have the lane keeping assistance enable and disable button. Between the front seats, we have a leather armrest. This opens to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment, but we don't have any USB or power ports inside. Top end trims get this partial LCD instrument cluster. We have a physical tachometer over here on the left, a physical fuel gauge and engine temperature gauge right over here on the right. But everything else that you're seeing is actually a digital gauge, including this oil temperature gauge over on the left and the battery voltage gauge over here on the right. This display is very similar to the one that we see in other General Motors models. We get a variety of different readouts there from our all-wheel drive system, digital speedometer, our trip computer information, etc. But we also have the option of seeing our infotainment information. So you can see right there our infotainment source. We can also browse media and choose the input right here with this screen and the controls on the steering wheel. We also have access to our Bluetooth integrated phone, a navigation display where we can actually get a turn-by-turn direction display or a moving map display right there in the center. And we can also change the way this display looks. We have two different skins open to us. The one we've been looking at is the Sport display. There's also a touring display, which gives us this digital speedometer right up top and a slightly cleaner look. But you'll notice that the information displayed in the middle of the screen is essentially the same as what we saw when we had that analog speedometer displayed. The steering wheel is a four-spoke design. We have sport grips up top and a lot of aluminum trim on either side. We find controls on both the back of the steering wheel and the front of the steering wheel. The controls for the cruise controller over here on the left, as well as the collision warning control. We also have a heated steering wheel button, dedicated phone button, voice command button. This joystick-style button bank controls that multifunction instrument cluster, and then you'll find the track forward and backward buttons and volume up and down buttons on the back of the steering wheel. Volume up and down is over here on the right, track up and down is over here on the left. The V6 all-wheel drive model that we're testing this week went from 0 to 60 in 6.8 seconds. That's quite impressive. That's actually faster than the Toyota Highlander, even though the Highlander has an 8-speed automatic, and this model still has the older 6-speed transmission from General Motors. Now, if you get the 4-cylinder engine, it does feel a little bit lethargic in comparison to the Highlander. 0 to 60 time is right around the same, and that is towards the slow end of this segment. 6.8 seconds is a very respectable acceleration time in the three-row crossover market, and you really won't get that much faster even if you choose options like the Ford Explorer Sport or the Dodge Durango V8. They are going to be a little bit faster than this, but the delta is smaller than you might think. The lighter carb weight also drastically helps out the braking score. This vehicle went from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 119 feet. That is considerably shorter than the last Acadia or Enclave that we tested. That actually puts this among the shortest stopping distances in this category. This is right around the same as what you'll find in the Kia Sorento, which is a little bit smaller than this. As you might have also expected, the lighter curb weight improves the handling in the Acadia markedly versus the last generation. We have lost nearly 800 pounds versus the last generation Acadia, so this vehicle feels much more nimble out here on your average winding mountain road, much more composed than the previous generation. We also have a suspension that is notably firmer than the previous Acadia as well. The firmer suspension, of course, helps make the handling a little bit crisper, but it does have an effect on the ride. The firmer suspension tuning is definitely noticeable out here on gravel roads, where the Acadia is much firmer than it was in the 2016 model year. You should also keep in mind we are in the Denali trim, so we get a little bit less cushion out of these extra large wheels and tires, and that does impact the ride just a little bit as well. In our cabin noise test, we scored 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour. That puts this right in the middle of the segment in terms of overall cabin noise. You'll find a few options that are a little bit quieter, and a few options that are a little bit louder. Over a week of mixed driving, we've been averaging 19.5 miles per gallon, which is just a little bit below what GM says we should be getting. I'm going to give this vehicle a B- overall when it comes to fuel economy, because even though this has improved drastically over the previous generation Acadia, it's still a little bit below vehicles like the Honda Pilot and the Toyota Highlander in real-world driving. You'll also find better fuel economy in something like a Nissan Pathfinder thanks to its continuously variable transmission, and the Pathfinder is a little bit larger than what we're driving here. Of course, if you want better fuel economy in a vehicle this size, you could get the 4-cylinder engine under the hood, but performance is really going to take a hit. The nature of the Acadia has changed so much between the previous generation and this generation, I'm actually surprised that General Motors didn't decide to just rename the model and call it something else. The previous generation Acadia felt big, it felt heavy out on the road, and this generation feels lighter, it feels more communicative, more nimble, and it is definitely faster to 60 than the previous model. Now that said, the model we're driving is not as engaging as a Mazda CX-9 or as an Acura MDX, and the MDX is definitely a solid competitor to this Denali model because they're right around the same price. So while this may be more engaging and more capable than something like a Toyota Highlander, it's not to that next level where we find the Acura. For 2017, the Acadia starts at $29,070, and that is for the base SL trim. As we see in a variety of other General Motors vehicles, the base model has a few limitations. You cannot add options to it, and the color palette is fairly limited. That said, it is a very good deal because it does come standard with the 17-inch alloy wheels, keyless entry and keyless go, the 7-inch infotainment system with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and 3-zone automatic climate control. The base 4-cylinder engine is possible again because of the massive curb weight reduction that we see in the 2017 Acadia versus the 2016 Acadia. If you want to add options or you want different interior or exterior colors than are available in the base trim, you have to step up to the SLE1 trim. This is also the model you have to select if you want all-wheel drive because it's not available in that base model. If you want the V6 engine that we tested this week, then you will have to step up to the SLE2 trim and then add the V6 engine, because it does not become standard until the SLT2 trim. That SLT2 trim is also the first model that comes standard with autonomous braking, pedestrian detection, auto high beams, front parking sensors, etc. Keep in mind, however, that although we do get those autonomous safety features, we don't have radar adaptive cruise control in that SLT2 trim. The Denali is the model that we spent most of our time this week in, and it started at $45,707, and if you were to add all of the options to it, you'd end up right around $56,000. This new Acadia is targeted directly at the Highlander, the Santa Fe, and the Pilot. However, the Denali trim has a slightly different competitive set in mind. You could compare it to top-end versions of the Mazda CX-9 or the Acura MDX. Now let's talk about the pros and cons. The powerful optional V6 engine is definitely a solid pro for this vehicle. As I said earlier, if you want a faster three-row crossover, there are few options. Even though the power figures that we see from this engine are not as high as what we see in the Ford Explorer Sport, the Explorer Sport is not that much faster. All versions of the Acadia also score very well when it comes to seat comfort. The third row is definitely compact compared to some of the larger options in this segment, but the seats themselves are fairly comfortable. We also have that very family-friendly feature that allows you to keep a child seat latch anchored into place on the passenger side of the second row and still get back there into the third row. That's a feature we see in something like the Nissan Pathfinder, but not in very many other three-row crossovers for some reason. On the downside of things, the fuel economy from the V6 engine lags behind the Honda Pilot with the 9-speed automatic or the Toyota Highlander with its 8-speed automatic. The fuel economy we experienced this week is not that far off of the Hyundai Santa Fe, but there are definitely more fuel-efficient options in this segment. The 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine improves fuel economy, however it definitely has an impact on acceleration. I suppose you could also call the overall reduction in size for the Acadia a con, because this is not as large as it was last year. Of course, the main reason for that is that we see an awful lot of combined General Motors brand dealers. So you may see a dealer with Buick, with GMC, and with Chevy all in the same dealer. If you visited a dealership like that in the past, you would notice that the Buick, the Chevy, and the GMC were all about the same size, but that's going to be a little bit different because now we have the Acadia on the smaller end of the scale, the Buick is going to be right there in the middle, and the Traverse will actually be considerably larger than the Acadia. The last thing I suppose you could put on the con side of the chart would be the MSRP of the Denali trim. It is quite high, and there really is no parallel among the mainstream competition. And that's because with the Denali trim, they're trying to make the Acadia compete not just with the Highlander or the Pilot, but also with the Acura MDX. Now let's dive into the competition. First up, we have the Toyota Highlander, which starts at $30,630. That is a little bit more expensive than the Acadia, however, it comes standard with the new Toyota Safety Sense package, which includes radar adaptive cruise control and autonomous braking. The important thing to remember is that all Highlander models for 2017 and forward will have that absolutely standard. The Highlander is also available as either a 7-passenger or an 8-passenger crossover, which is a little bit different than we see out of the Acadia. The main reason for that, of course, is that the Highlander's third row is very compact, and in order to get 8 passengers in the vehicle, you have to squeeze 3 across that tiny third row. On the General Motors side, if you want 8 passengers in your large crossover, you buy a Traverse, not an Acadia now. As we see in the Acadia, a 4-cylinder engine is standard in the Highlander, the V6 is optional, and that V6 will set you back $35,060 in the Toyota, $37,090 in the Acadia, because we do have to step up to that SLE2 trim in order to get the V6 engine. When you compare the base V6 Acadia to the base V6 Highlander, the Acadia does seem more expensive, and that's fairly consistent as we work our way on up the option ladder to the top-end trims. However, keep in mind that you will see deeper discounts at the GMC dealer than at the Toyota dealer. So in actual real-world transactions, the Acadia is likely going to be less expensive than a comparably equipped Toyota, even though the MSRP on the advertisement may initially be a little bit higher. This is something that we see not just from General Motors, but also from Chrysler and to some extent from Ford as well. Some manufacturers' vehicles tend to stick very close to the MSRP when it actually comes time to buy one at a dealer, and some manufacturers' vehicles end up a very consistent discount from that MSRP. In terms of overall ride and handling, I would actually take the GMC Acadia over the Toyota Highlander just by a little bit. I think the Toyota is very well sorted for 2017, however the new Acadia just has a slightly better level of polish, likely because the Highlander has been around for a little bit and they've just tweaked it by adding a few extra features for 2017. Next up we have the Hyundai Santa Fe, which we recently reviewed, so you can find a video just on that model on our channel as well. The design of the Santa Fe is a little bit older than the average in this segment, although it has received just a little bit of a refresh for 2017. The V6 engine is standard in the Santa Fe, as is a very long warranty, although options are limited, so you don't have the same degree of customization in your Hyundai as we find especially in the Ford or in the GMC or in the Chevy, where we have a lot of standalone options and a lot of various different option packages. Fuel economy is fairly similar between the Santa Fe and the Acadia V6, although in our real-world driving tests, sometimes we did get slightly better fuel economy in the Hyundai Santa Fe. Although I think some of that has to do with the way that we were driving the Acadia. It's capable of being driven harder than the Santa Fe, and we perhaps were having a little bit more fun with it out on the road. Handling ability is definitely something that we should put on the pro side for the Acadia versus the Santa Fe, but the Santa Fe is a very, very good deal in this segment. It's a solid value entry, even though we don't have those standard safety features that we do see in the Toyota Highlander. Next up, we have the Honda Pilot at $30,595 starting. Because of the overall design of the Pilot, the rear seats don't feel quite as constrained as we find in the Highlander, but you're not going to find as much room as we see in the larger Chevy Traverse. So again, the General Motors target for the 8-passenger version of the Pilot really is the Chevy Traverse. You'll find a roomier interior, and they've left the Acadia to be that 6- or 7-passenger vehicle. Honda's autonomous safety package is called Honda Sensing. It includes radar adaptive cruise control, the autonomous braking, pre-collision warning, etc. That package is available on the Pilot even in low-end trims, but it's not standard on the Pilot in low-end trims like we see in the Highlander. The Pilot falls on either side of the Acadia when it comes to handling, thanks to the available torque vectoring rear axle. The torque vectoring rear axle is only available in the top-end trims of the Pilot, however, so top-end trims of the Pilot feel a little bit more like an Acura MDX out on the road. The lower-end trims of the Pilot feel a little bit less capable overall than the Acadia out on the road. The Acadia does have a solid feel to it. It has sort of a firmer feel to it than the Pilot. The Pilot feels a little bit more chuckable, but in actual road handling ability, I would say the Acadia slots right in between those two different versions of the Pilot. Of course, the torque vectoring rear axle is available in the Acadia, but only if you get the all-terrain package in the Acadia. The other models, including the Denali, don't get it. Because we have been driving the Acadia Denali this week, it's appropriate to talk about the Acura MDX as well. The MDX and the Pilot are very closely related. In fact, the engine and the transmission in the top-end trims of the Honda Pilot are basically the same ones that we find in the Acura MDX, as is the all-wheel drive system. Of course, having a Pilot and having an MDX is a very different thing than having just one model that we add additional trim to in order to compete with luxury entries. And that's largely why the Acadia Denali feels less refined overall inside the cabin than the Acura MDX. This is the same sort of thing that we see over in the Chrysler lineup, where we see the Jeep Grand Cherokee going on up to Overland and Summit trims, where they add a lot of nicer features inside the cabin, but the basics of the cabin are still the same as the more mainstream model. That's not what we see over on the Acura side. So even though we see parts quality that is not that far off of the Honda Pilot inside the cabin of the MDX, it gets uniquely styled, so very few parts are directly shared. In terms of overall pricing, the MDX starts at $44,050, and fully loaded it'll end up right around $60,000. That is a little bit more expensive than the Acadia Denali. Discounts are not quite as heavy on the street with the Denali as with the other versions of the Acadia, so you should expect it to be a little bit less expensive than the MDX, but it's not going to be a massive delta. The 9-speed automatic transmission under the hood of the MDX is sort of a pro and a con, because it does improve performance and it improves fuel economy. Unfortunately, it's not exactly the smoothest transmission available in this particular segment. The 6-speed that we see in the Acadia Denali is definitely more of a team player. Thanks to the overall design of the MDX and the sporty mission that Acura has with that particular vehicle, it feels much more nimble, much more lively out on the road compared to the Acadia Denali. My overall top pick in this segment continues to be the 2017 Kia Sorento. Obviously, if you need the extra room, the Sorento is not going to be the best pick for you, especially if you're contemplating not just the Acadia but also the Buick or the Chevy, because those are considerably larger than the Kia. However, the Kia has a very well-finished interior, it has an extremely aggressive base price, and a very long warranty. It also has decent performance from the base engines and excellent performance out of the V6 or the optional 2-liter turbocharged engine. In terms of overall cargo space, it's not going to be that far off of the Acadia because they both are on the smaller end of this particular segment. The Sorrento's third row, however, is definitely going to be a little bit more compact than we find in the GMC. My top value pick in this segment continues to be the 2017 Hyundai Santa Fe. We have that standard V6 engine and the very long warranty. It also is very aggressively priced in that base form. Now, we don't have the advanced safety features that we find in the Toyota Highlander, and I do think that is a little bit disappointing. I wish Hyundai would start pushing those down into the lower end trims. In terms of overall value, though, I actually think that the base version of the Acadia ties with the Hyundai Santa Fe because of the aggressive low price that we find in the Acadia, the high level of standard features that we find even in that 4-cylinder model, and the fact that you can get more off of the Acadia at the GMC dealer than you will off the Santa Fe at the Hyundai dealer. So real-world transaction pricing is going to be very aggressive on the GMC. On the other end of the Acadia spectrum, we have the Acadia Denali. And if you're taking a look at the Acadia Denali, I would suggest you put the Acura MDX high on your shopping list as well. I think the MDX's overall higher level of polish compensates for that 9-speed automatic transmission. You also get a luxury branded vehicle instead of a mainstream branded vehicle, even though Denali is sort of a luxury sub-brand. I would also suggest perhaps waiting for the Buick Enclave to come out, because I think the Enclave is likely going to be a slightly better deal than the GMC Acadia Denali overall. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2017 GMC Acadia. Be sure and check out those related videos that you'll see on your screen in just a moment. You can find us over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos. You can also find us over at patreon.com if you want to support this channel. I'll see you next week.